Today we are looking at Chapter 5, the Legislative Branch. And the Legislative Branch is made up of Congress. Well, Congress is made up of two different parts, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So we're going to look at those two houses of Congress. But first we're going to figure out why are there two houses of Congress. And there's two reasons. So there's a lot of twos. But there are two reasons for that. And the first is that it is based on checks and balances. That we want those two houses to balance each other out and to check each other's power. So it makes sure that one part of it isn't too powerful. The second reason is that it helped when we had the Constitutional Convention. Dividing up Congress to make it balance each other is actually going to help settle the fight between the smaller states and the larger states. The small states wanted things based equally, and the larger states wanted things based on population. So having two houses allows us to actually make both sides happy with a compromise. So we're going to start off looking at the House of Representatives. And with the House of Representatives, there are today 435 members. Each member or each representative is going to serve for a length of term of 2 years. So they are elected to a 2-year term. There is no limit on the number of terms that they can have. So they could serve for 1 term, they could serve for 10 terms, they could serve for 20 terms. It just depends on how often they can get reelected. Each state has a different number of representatives, and that is determined based on each state's population. So every 10 years we have that wonderful census that we learned about in Chapter 1. And that census is going to tell us how our population is growing. And from that census, from those numbers, Congress is able to determine how many representatives go to each state. So every 10 years they kind of have to reevaluate how they're going to divide up the 435. So each state has their seats apportioned, and apportioned means distributed or divided up. For the House of Representatives, their elections are every 2 years. It is held in November of each even-numbered year, so their next election is November of 2012. For the Senate, it's kind of the same thing. They have a set number. They have 100 members, and that is because there are 2 per state. Their length of terms is for 6 years, and there is, not a limit on the number of terms that they can serve. And like I said, each state has 2, so it is an equal representation. For the senators, their elections are also held in November of even-numbered years. And they are a little bit different because for the House, all 435 members are up for re-election. In the Senate, not all 100 are up at the same time. So they stagger them. 1/3 are up for an election every 2 years. So for one election, there's going to be 33 that are up. The next election, another 33 are up for re-election. And then the final one is 34. So they stagger it out a little bit. Qualifications. The Constitution does give qualifications for who can be a senator and who can be a representative. We're going to start with the House first. For representatives, they must be a minimum age of 25. They must be a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years. And they also need to be residents of their state, so they have to be a legal resident of the state that they are representing. For the senators, the minimum age is 30, and their citizenship must be for at least 9 years. They also must be legal residents of the states that they represent. So those are the constitutional qualifications. However, there are several other things that people look for their representatives in government. So things that you typically are going to look for, you want someone who has had previous political experience, someone who kind of knows the ropes, that knows how government works and knows how to pass a law and those kinds of things. That's what they're going to be looking for. So typically, people that run and people that get elected are lawyers or businessmen. There's a lot that come from education and are bankers into finance. Those kinds of things are what people are looking for. The next thing we're going to look at are salaries and benefits. And the 27th Amendment is going to regulate the salaries of congressional people. So it's roughly $130,000 a year is what they get. But they also get a lot of other benefits in addition to that salary. They get their own office in Washington, D.C. They get free tickets home to fly home to visit their home states. They get an allowance for their DC office, and they also get an allowance for their state office as well, for staff and for secretaries and clerks and all that kind of thing that they're working with. They also get something called a franking privilege, and franking privilege is free postage. So if they wanted to send things home to everybody in their state, they could and not have to pay for the stamp postage on that. They get another thing called immunity. And immunity is legal protection where they cannot be sued or arrested for things that are said or written while they're in session in Congress. It does not apply for if they're just walking down the street. It only applies when they're in session, because sometimes these sessions can last for a long time and they're there for hours arguing about something, and sometimes people's tempers flare and they say things that they don't mean, or they write things that they don't mean, or that they did it in a fit of temper and then realized that was kind of stupid to say that. But they are held to a very high standard. They do have rules of conduct that they have to follow. For example, they cannot use their campaign funds that are supposed to be to get them reelected. They can't use those things for personal expenses. So they can't use it to get cosmetic surgery or to buy new cars or anything like that. It has to be used for their campaign. So like creating commercials and traveling to give speeches, those kinds of things. That's what it's supposed to be used for. They also have a limit on how much outside income they can have. That if they own their own business or if they have another job, there's only so much money that they can make. If they break some of these rules, they can be expelled from Congress. However, they have to have a 2/3 vote in order to do that. And typically you have to have committed some sort of legal, very serious crime. If you don't commit a serious crime, but you do something that's kind of considered bad behavior, like doing something in public that's embarrassing to Congress, they can be subjected to something called censure. And censure is where, if it's a less serious charge, they'll bring you down. They'll bring the senator or the representative, and they'll bring them down in front of the entire Congress. And they force them to stand in front while they're being told exactly what they did wrong and why it was wrong, and that there is an expectation of better behavior. So it's kind of like being called in front of your class and being told that you're misbehaving, and so everybody's kind of looking at you. And it's more of an embarrassment technique to get them to behave than anything else. It's not really a legal thing. They're not going to serve any jail time, and they're not going to pay any fines. It's more of it looks bad. It reflects badly on their character. So how is Congress organized? Well, it's organized into terms and sessions, and we already learned about the terms that the House has a 2-year term and the Senate has a 6-year term. But these terms are organized into sessions, and you have a session every year. So there's a session that they hold every year. Both sessions for the 2-year term of a representative, both sessions run from August or September all the way up till typically they get done about June. If there's serious problems, the president can call them back into session. For example, with 9/11, Congress was currently out of session during 9/11, and so President Bush is going to call them back into session in order to deal with the consequences of the terrorist attacks. There's also a thing called a joint session, and a joint session is where both the Senate and the House meet together, and that typically doesn't happen. Usually the House meets separately from the Senate because otherwise it gets really, really crowded. But occasionally they will meet together for a joint session, especially if they're trying to figure something out. Now, both the House and the Senate have to agree to be done before anybody can go home. So they both have to say, we're done passing laws for this year or for this session, before they're able to go back to their home states or go on vacation. So if the House gets done and the Senate doesn't, the House has to stick around until the Senate gets done. Next, we're going to look at the organization, and the Constitution requires that the House select a presiding officer. So that is the Speaker of the House. And the Senate also has a presiding officer, and the presiding officer for the Senate is the Vice President of the United States. Now, when they organize Congress, the Republicans and the Democrats gather together in private meetings, which they call caucuses, and that's where they choose their leaders. So that's where they begin to choose, okay, who's going to be the Speaker of the House, who's going to be the Senate pro tempore. And so what they're figuring out is they're looking at who's the majority party. So who's the majority party of the House? Who's the majority party of the Senate? And what they're looking at is the majority party would be the party with the most members. And the minority party would be the party with the least members in each house. So from that, they're able to choose their leaders, because in the leaders of the House, the Speaker of the House always comes from the majority party. Typically, it's somebody who's very, very powerful, who has been there for a while, has proven themselves, and it is a very powerful position, because if you want to speak in the House when there's laws being debated, the Speaker of the House is the only one who can call on you. You can't just blurt out stuff. There are rules that you have to follow, and the Speaker is the one who chooses who gets to speak. So it's a very powerful position. When we get to the Senate, the leaders of the Senate, like I said, includes the Vice President. But the Vice President, as leader of the Senate, cannot take part in the debates. They only vote if there's a tie. And so if the Vice President can't be there, you got to have somebody step in, and that person is going to be the President pro tempore. And the President pro tempore is the person who is elected by the Senate to be in charge or to preside over the Senate when the Vice President is gone. And again, they try not to take part in the debate. They only vote in cases of a tie. Well, in both houses of Congress, you have committees. And the reason you have committees is because there's just too many bills that are going through. And a bill is a proposed law. So there's all these laws that get proposed every year. And you got to kind of weed out the ones that aren't necessary or that are kind of out there and crazy, because anybody can submit a law. Anybody can submit a bill to be looked at. So what they do is they have standing committees, and standing committees are ones that are always there. They're the ones that cover general topics like transportation or agriculture or education, and so bills that deal with those specific topics go right into those committees right away. And these standing committees, they have subcommittees. The Senate has 17 standing committees, the House has 19, and each of these standing committees has subcommittees, and these subcommittees kind of divided out. So if you were to look at education, the standing committee might say, okay, some of you are going to look at school lunch menus, some of you are going to look at testing, others are going to look at violence in schools. So they kind of subdivided out. Another kind of committee that you can have is the select committee, and a select committee deals with issues that aren't really handled by the standing committee. So maybe it's something that comes up that's out of the ordinary. So like when Hurricane Katrina hit, or when we had the 9/11 terrorist attacks, they created committees to specifically look into those events and the government's response to them. The next kind of a committee is a joint committee, and a joint committee is where both houses work together, where the House committee and the Senate committee is going to join forces. And then you have a conference committee, and a conference committee is where everybody, not just the committees, but everybody, the whole House and the whole Senate come together to work out a compromise, because maybe the House passed something and the Senate passed something pretty similar to it, but there's some differences. So you meet together in a conference committee and try to hash out those differences. Committee membership, typically the majority party decides who is going to be in charge of each committee, and so the chairperson, who is in charge of the committee, they get to decide what bills they're going to look at. And because there's so much for them to go through, they do have congressional staffs, and a congressional staff includes like assistants and secretaries and research assistants, people who do all kind of the background information and getting things ready. So it is a very, very busy thing to be a part of Congress, and it's very important to get into leadership roles, because then you have a lot of say in what is actually going to be considered by Congress. So our next video will be looking at the powers of Congress and what kind of things they are actually able to do according to our Constitution.